SecurityScorecard's Strike Threat Intelligence team has released new research findings this week on SecurityScorecard.com and declawed.io, showing there are tens of thousands of exposed OpenClaw control panels on the internet, many of which are vulnerable to attack. Jeremy, when people hear AI agents are going rogue with OpenClaw or Moltbook, they imagine AI agents revolting or becoming malicious. But this research that you released this week shows something else entirely: the security risks of exposing PII or sensitive accounts with Agentic AI. What are your takeaways from the research so far? There's a lot in this dashboard at declawed.io, and I wonder if you could break it down for our listeners today.
The first thing is the sheer volume of these exposed instances out there. Certainly with the new technology and all the press that has gained focus in this area, a lot of technologists are very eager to explore this and experiment with it, which is great. But what we see is that a lot of these deployments have a lot of security vulnerabilities, misconfigurations, or potentially even new vulnerabilities introduced by the AI itself as users are experimenting with it. Declaw.io is really a site that we created that can provide everybody a quick overview and visibility into the scale and scope of the problem, especially to enable security operations and threat intelligence teams to get ahead of this and understand it, because certainly the perspective that we see is the same one that the adversaries see as well.
I remember when you all first kicked off the research, in the first 24 hours, you were looking at exposed control panels and there were 40,000 plus, and it's since grown to far beyond that. I wonder if you can bring us into delving into that research. What were your reactions? What were the patterns and trends that you pulled out immediately in the research that are important for these security leaders to walk away with today?
Yeah, certainly, to your point, the exposures that we saw when we first started collecting the data versus where it's at today, the growth in the amount of exposures that exist here is probably the most incredible feature. It's a pretty staggering growth rate. Usually when we do scans for a vulnerability, what we start with in the first scan is the most of the exposure, and then over time it decreases. In this case, because it's a new technology and more users are adopting it, we see that trend actually doing the opposite, kind of increasing and compounding as more folks kind of get interested in these different agentic AI solutions.
And for anyone listening, I wonder if you could just give a brief overview of OpenClaw and how we got here from ClawdBot, Moltbot, OpenClaw, and Moltbook. What is it that is so appealing about this agentic AI that is leading to all of this adoption?
Yeah, so with all the AIs here that we've discussed, the appeal is that these things like OpenClaw and the others you mentioned are that they can take actions and do things for users. It's kind of like having an assistant or like another helper where, you can just text it, hey, can you book a flight for me? Can you respond to this email? Can you, create a API that serves up documents? All those little different things are things that the AI can be tasked with and is actually capable and has permissions and access to actually go through and actually make changes to resources in the system or respond to email or messages or any of the other integrations that the user has enabled. So instead of just answering questions or writing code, it can actually go ahead and implement those things or make those changes.
In the research, you found that many of these instances were vulnerable to remote code execution. Many were tied to past breaches. Can you walk us through what it means for a user of OpenClaw and for an enterprise that might be concerned about OpenClaw or other agentic AI workflows that we have these exposures, particularly from the remote code execution, the RCE standpoint?
RCEs, or remote code execution vulnerabilities, these are different exposures that essentially give an address or a service where an attacker can take a crafted message and send it to that service and be able to execute code on the system. So this is the open door or open window, so to speak, where it's like a straight path for adversaries from having no access to having the ability to access systems and make changes. So that there's multiple facets to this kind of exposure. The remote code execution vulnerabilities are a big one. There's other APIs and service exposures that are unauthenticated for users. So there's quite like a different, like, I guess if you could say, like, all the threat scenarios apply in this case. There's kind of every different type of vulnerability you can imagine in this set of exposures that we're discussing on declawed.io.
And so if we talk about that from the standpoint of an enterprise or an organization that's worried about individuals using OpenClaw in their spare time or even OpenClaw deployments at the business, how can these folks look at the risk that they have today and examine if they are at risk based on this data set?
Certainly, they want to be aware that if users create these services or create these kind of exposures in their organization, they'll also be aware of all their third parties and suppliers that might have users or technology teams that are experimenting with this. It's very easy to create pretty serious vulnerability and data exposures with these technologies. It's literally just like hiring somebody and placing them in the organization with access to whatever data is on that system where the software gets installed. Then that user also has the ability to make configuration changes and do other things on the system. So it creates all the traditional exposures that normally an individual would. But in this case, because it's AI, there's a whole host of other vulnerabilities, like another layer of vulnerability that exists here that doesn't typically.
I'm curious as well your thought on the responsibility for patching at this point, because I think a lot of the vulnerabilities we found, there are some patches available with respect to some of the OpenClaw deployments. But the big picture is what we're looking at here tells us that most people are not running those patches. These users are not really keeping up on their security to-do list, so to speak. How can users, how can OpenClaw, how can other organizations think about securing agentic workflows at this point?
Think with OpenClaw, it's kind of interesting because this is really released as a use case or feature example from a researcher saying like, hey, here's some code, but they never really intended it to be something that folks used kind of in a production environment. And I think that that's where we're seeing the eagerness in the industry for this type of solution and the appetite for new AI technology adoption. But then also there's the other side of that this is like there's a lot of uncharted territory here, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. Most organizations really don't have a security model for agentic AI being deployed on end user systems. Technology is advancing at a rate where the traditional security mechanisms and business processes just really can't keep up.
If you could zoom out for us, we're talking about some of the enterprise risks, some of the risk for individuals on a massive scale. We're talking about so many exposed instances and so many critical vulnerabilities. Are we talking about the potential for bad actors or script kiddies to make a botnet? Are we talking about impersonation risk? Are we talking about leaked PII? Walk us through some of these potential nightmare scenarios that could happen based on what we know at this point from the data.
It's pretty safe to say that somebody will try to make a botnet out of these exposures. And also, given that a lot of these agentic AI solutions are installed in systems that have GPUs, deploying malware to mine cryptocurrency, if that hasn't happened, I'm sure it's going to happen in the very near future. So in all cases, I think the users just need to be aware that when they install these things, there's a lot of additional exposures that are going to come along with it. And there's no shortage of adversaries that want to target those exposures if they aren't already.
And very quickly for our listeners, why is it so important that the powerful GPUs are a part of the conversation? How does that enable or exacerbate the existing vulnerabilities and issues here?
Yeah, the GPUs are an asset for the AI models. If users want to run their own instance of these AI models locally, which has a lot of benefits, they're gonna want to have a pretty powerful GPU to enable that. It's the same kind of resources and system specifications that the different threat actors that are trying to mine cryptocurrency. It's a golden opportunity, and I'm sure it's not going to be missed on those threat actors.
In the context of third-party breaches, we've talked about both AI and how it will impact defensive cybersecurity and offensive cyber. And we've also talked about third-party breaches for years and how that happens. But how can organizations think about AI agents themselves being that new third party, whether they're acting on someone's behalf or acting within an organization? How can organizations conceptualize this as a new attack surface?
The best way to think about AI agents as an attack surface, or like think about if you had a internship program for, students that really know how to code, but also might have a criminal history. How can you take advantage of the skill sets and start working with this technology, but not really expose all of your organization to the potential risks? And a lot of that has to do with some pretty, significant fundamentals in cybersecurity. It's like network and data segmentation, role-based access security policies, multi-factor authentication. All these different kind of processes should also apply to agentic AI. Users really need to consider like what is the threat model that they're trying to protect against. And with agentic AI, much different than even the traditional large language models and quote AI, regular AI. There's a lot of additional exposures here that really need to be considered. And certainly it's better to think about the AI agents as like individuals, because how they get commands and how they interpret instructions is important. But then also what data and what access do they have if they misinterpret those instructions? Like how can you really kind of minimize the blast radius?
I want to ask one quick question about some of the data back in the dashboard. There's a piece that shows us about known threat actors, APT linkage. Those are nation state threat actors. What is the data telling us here? Are we, for instance, seeing nation state threat actors using OpenClaw, or is this historical correlation with infrastructure? And what can security leaders take away from that piece of the dashboard?
It's really probably more correlation than causation. It's interesting to highlight this because there's known malicious infrastructure, and if we see agentic AI being deployed in those same places, we can infer that threat actors are adopting those technologies. The other part of the correlation is that for a lot of the different infrastructure, like cloud hosting providers or VPS solutions providers, where users are naturally going to go to try to experiment with things in an isolated way, that's also the same kind of infrastructure that threat actors typically use. So right now in this dashboard, it's just a broad correlation of all the threat actor infrastructure that's been attributed to threat actors in the past. There might be some future room to modify that. And we've gotten some feedback already that like, hey, it'd be great if we could just see this within threat actors that have used that infrastructure within the last like month, versus 3 years. So there's a lot of different ways to look at the data. But what we wanted to do is just highlight the fact that there is correlation between threat actor infrastructure or where we see threat actors leveraging infrastructure and also the agentic AI solutions. There's a lot more to that story and we could really dig deep there. So I don't want to take us down a rabbit hole on that one, but it's
No,
very
no, that's
interesting to
helpful.
see the data.
Yeah. So if we zoom out and we look at this from a 30,000-foot view, I know, Jeremy, you and I have talked before about how can people using OpenClaw in their spare time, in their personal life, trying to start businesses, how they can secure this and how they can securely deploy this. When you overlay that advice you've shared before with this data, are there any new takeaways you can share with us about how folks can think about using agentic AI? What are those practical security steps people can take today?
Absolutely take advantage of it because it's really cool. It was really nice of the researchers that developed these tools to actually open source them and democratize access to this technology for a lot of users, but also take great care. It's kind of like candy flavored dynamite. So in the right context, it's very useful and really cool. At the same time, it also creates a lot of exposures that most users wouldn't be aware of. If they're casual users that are used to downloading, installing some software on the internet and using it, this is going to be opening a lot of other exposures that traditionally they haven't had to consider in the past. It's like it's akin to getting on a boat and going out on a lake or a little stream versus getting on a boat and going out into the middle of the ocean by yourself. You're really going to want to have all the skills necessary to know how to handle different situations before you find yourself in an actual difficult situation.
Like
So
really,
there's
really audit how often you're giving your credit card to your AI assistant.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, if you feel like you have the skills, then like go for it. But I mean, also at the same time, you wouldn't jump on a sailboat and try to cross the Atlantic. There's a lot of different nuanced aspects to this technology that are very technical and require a lot of careful consideration. So I would say that the easiest way to start experimenting with this is to create an isolated system. Try to segment this as much as possible. If you were to give a computer to somebody random in the park and say, hey, here's my computer, do stuff with it. You'd want to have the same confidence when you install something like especially some of these early forms of agentic AI. You want to have that situation where you're comfortable just kind of relinquishing control to whatever you hand it, because the odds are that it could be exposed pretty easily.
This research really is incredible to look through. So if you haven't taken a look yet, you can see it at securityscorecard.com/strike or declad.io, where data is refreshing every 15 minutes to provide the most up-to-date view. And you can connect with Security Scorecard and the Strike Threat Intelligence team for detailed reports, custom intel feeds, or API access at declad.io. Thank you, Jeremy.
Thank you.